Welcome to another presentation in the series where we're looking at education as it moves into the future. As education moves forward, we must make our plans based on evidence. The focus of this series of presentations is very much on the evidence coming from research. And we're looking at what the evidence from research can tell us today so that we can plan for tomorrow. This is the third presentation in the series, and we're going to be looking at the research process itself, the place of research in education. Research is an attempt to find things out, but it raises the question, how do we know that we know? What are the main sources of evidence? In wider society, we might put it like that. We know something because someone in authority says so. Or we know something because tradition and the past pattern of life has always done it this way. Or we know something because our experience tells us it works for us. But there's also the evidence from research. Where does that fit? How does it relate to the other sources? Within the teaching profession, there is a rich experience in teaching. If you watch an experienced teacher operate with a class, it can be a truly exciting experience as they demonstrate the skills that have grown up through the years. We need to recognize that depth of experience and the value in it. But we need to bring it together with the evidence from quality research. The two must come together. It's a partnership. One of the problems in modern day education is the way that the practice of teaching is so often separated off from the evidence from quality research. And the two don't interact. We've got to address that issue. You see, rich teaching experience can define the key agendas, can show us the kind of things that we need to look at, things that are maybe going well or not going well. It brings reality to research activities, what actually can be made to work in the practicalities of the teaching situation. But what research can do is it can interpret and widen teaching experience, which is often limited to one person or one school. And it can lead to greater possibilities for the future by giving the principles that underpin the observations from experience. The two must come together in partnership. We could summarize it this way. Experience can provide evidence, but inevitably the evidence will be individual to that teacher, that department, that school. Research can provide evidence, but the evidence may be on a bigger scale, and therefore it may underline and pick out principles which are widely applicable. So it relates to the experience that comes from the individual teacher, and each can feed off the other and inform the other. It's a total partnership. Now, in some areas of life in modern societies, this works extremely well. You can see it perhaps most clearly in an area like medicine, where the medical practitioners at whatever level they're working are taking note of, drawing from the evidence of research, and it alters and affects what they actually do with patients. But equally, the researcher is drawing from the evidence that have come from practitioners to identify issues or problems or successes, to build on them and to understand why they are working that way. They each feed off the other. Now, in education, we've got to learn how to do that. At this stage, worldwide, we haven't done it very well. We've got to start and think about this word research. Here are a few quotations from famous people. Van Gogh, by seeking and blundering we learn. Many a researcher would echo that phrase. The great entrepreneur and businessman, research serves to make building stones out of stumbling blocks, a nice play of ideas. But it's so true. It's the problems that learners have that often define an agenda that we have to address. And one of the greatest thinkers of all time, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research. You see, research goes into the unknown. It cannot predict what's going to come out. And we've got to think about that in education, because we're not matching up to that picture. A process of going up blind alleys to see if they're blind. Negative results, problem areas, things that don't work are just as informative as the breakthrough successes. And Von Braun said that research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing. You see, there's a danger of systematizing research so precisely that we know where we're going. Then it's not real research. Because research means going into the unknown. We don't know what we're going to expect. We don't know what we're going to find. And if we can plan it, it isn't research. We've got to keep it open. So what is it? Now here is my possible description. You may be able to develop a better one, but this at least gives us something to work on. The systematic and coherent investigation into some aspect of the world around in order to find out what is happening and why it happens that way. Now that description is meant to capture in all areas of research. Now you might have to adjust it if you're involved in historical research, because it might be what has happened and why it happened that way. But these are small adjustments that have to be made to that description. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail, because that's the goal of research. There's no point in doing research if it doesn't lead to possibilities of benefit for humankind. It's a waste of time completely if we don't take that one on board. We need to be looking at the benefit that can come. And it's got to be realistic and practical benefit. Now you can't predict exactly what's going to come from research, so it's potential. Let's lift out two words: systematic and coherent. We're looking at some area of inquiry, and in study after study after study, we're building up a picture and understanding of what is happening and why it is happening. Too often, sadly, in education, unlike other disciplines, we've got one-off projects developed by, say, a PhD candidate. That is not systematic, and that's not coherent. It needs some central control direction, bringing things together. We'll look at that in more detail in a moment. But it's another little phrase that we could pull out. We're not just looking at what is happening, we're looking at why it happens that way. Not opinions, but evidence. And again, in education, we fail so often in that because we describe what is happening and we pass our comments on it, but they're just our comments. But we never get at the why it happens. We may express an opinion about it, but we don't get the evidence. So our description here leads to some pointers that can help us. But we've got to again come back to that. If research is just done for its own sake, for the fun of it, or as a game we play, or to get a PhD, it's pointless. The central goal is greater understanding leading to potential human benefit. It's got to be that way. Well, what does research involve? That is certainly true. Research is not glamorous. We may enter into it thinking we're going to make some momentous breakthrough. It doesn't work that way. These things arise from long stretches of hard work, disciplined work, and often considerable repetition. We do things again and again, looking for reasons why. Now, in almost all areas of research, it's not an individual activity. Teams of workers are consistently exploring some area of inquiry. Now, that seems to run contradictory to the PhD experience, where it's one PhD student. It isn't necessarily so, and indeed across most disciplines in most universities, PhD students do work in teams. Research supervisor or supervisors have formed a team. There may be 2, 3, 4, maybe more PhD students working. They've each got their own project, but it's part of a coherent, systematic area of inquiry. It's not randomly going off in various directions. Research is teamwork. And the individual going off and making the wonderful breakthrough is rare, though it can happen. And of course, when we find it, we have to make it known to others. The mechanism that checks whether what we've done is worth doing and has value is by the peer review process from other experienced researchers. Far from a perfect system, but it's better than nothing. And it does challenge, and there are many, many examples in many areas of inquiry where the system has worked extremely well. And I've pictured this even in a university setup. It's teamwork. So for example, in medical research, they're looking at a disease or a group of diseases, and several projects are exploring different aspects of this, and together they're building up a coherent picture. You can get exactly the same in the physical sciences, the biological sciences, the applied sciences, mathematics. You can see the same pattern happening. You can see the same pattern happening in psychology. So it works right across the board. In education, we've got a lot to learn about this. So we're back to our description. Systematic, coherent. What is happening, but why it happens that way. Well, education research, well, it's not a good story. Here is some evidence. At a very large educational conference of international stature, the papers of over 300 were analysed. 72% involved opinion gathering, mainly by questionnaires. Stop for a minute. How can we take decisions on opinion gathering? And does that really get at answers to the future? Does it answer the question why? Is there any certainty that the opinions you've gathered are giving a correct picture? Can people see themselves or the situation correctly? They may be totally honest. 72%, that's frightening. But to show you that's not a one-off, randomly 3 issues of an international journal were taken. Almost every paper was just descriptive, just describing what's happening, never getting to the issues behind why, the explanations, the broader principles. Over 60% in this journal used questionnaires, and when it was analysed by a statistician, almost all of them, the statistics were inappropriate. The wrong methods were being used. That is frightening. If these two pieces of evidence are found to be replicated, and it does appear to be the case on a wider scale, then we've got something seriously wrong. As a result, if you look at the studies, and this was done, very few of them revealed anything new or anything of value to practicing teachers. Now, in the end of the day, education is about teachers and their learners. That's the central focus of all educational activity. Learners guided by teachers. But all that effort, all that energy, all that organisation, almost nothing was coming out of value. No wonder our practicing teachers don't read research journals and rarely go to conferences of this sort, because they're getting nothing of value back. Now here's a possibility of what could be. I'll put it into three categories. Educational research should be focused tightly on making sense of teaching and learning, because teaching and learning are the central core of all educational activity. That's what education's all about. And all the other things round about are there to make that richer or more possible, to enable it to happen. Educational research must move into the unknown. Now, you can't guarantee you're going to find something rivetingly exciting that's going to transform the world. That's going to be very rare. But moving into the unknown, unlikely to enhance the learning process, to bring benefit to future learners directly or indirectly. Now, there is some key central goals for education. And if we look at all our educational research programs and just match them against these goals, how would they match up? You see, we need to understand why learning takes place in specific ways. Not just what's happening, not just descriptions, but why. And we've got to find things that are simply new, not known to experienced and skilled teachers. What's the point of all the energy and effort if you get 2 or 3 teachers together and they could tell you the answers? They just know it from experience. They know it from what they've been doing day in, day out. So we've got to focus on what may be important and potentially valuable. That takes a bit of skill and a bit of thought. Bringing the two together, possibilities plus sadness. What I've looked at is I've analysed the kind of research that's published and the research done in PhDs. And over the years I must have evaluated 30, 40, 50 PhD theses in education. I do not recall the number. A large number of studies of what I've called post hoc or descriptive. They're looking at something that has happened or is happening, and then at the end they comment with the wisdom of hindsight. That's very, very common. It reveals almost nothing. Almost a complete waste of time. Then you've got sometimes, it's not so common, a research study that's built on what I've called the bright idea of the researcher. Maybe it's come out of their teaching experience. Maybe they've just suddenly had the bright idea. They think they've got the answer. So they explore this possibility and see if it works, if it is the answer. Almost always they find, in their view, it is the answer, because it's the answer for them. Will it be the answer if it was transferred anywhere else? You see, it ignores the wider evidence, and usually what works for them, and it's great if it does work for them, it doesn't transfer neatly. There are contexts and situations, even the personality of the individual involved may make something possible that can't be transferred more widely. Then there are a small number of studies that look at some aspect in inch-by-inch detail, nitpicking detail. Now the problem with that kind of research is it's difficult to stand back and see the wider picture. You get so involved in the nitty-gritty detail, you can't see the bigger picture and you can't see the implications. So it's limited. There are a few research projects that look at previous research evidence and say, well, the evidence suggests that if we do this, we would get that, and that will be beneficial. So it uses previous evidence to predict, and then it tests the prediction. Now that's sound research. We need more of that. But the best kind is this, what I've called the why research. It asks the question, why about some aspect of learning? Why do things happen this way? Why do learners find this kind of thing difficult? Why do learners find this kind of thing accessible? Why is it this kind of approach generates positive attitudes and great motivation? You can go on asking these why questions. Now that gets at principles. And it offers clear practical ways forward to enhance learning. Because you're getting behind what's happening to the why it happens. We need more of that. Now, if you put them together, the top three, which probably take up the vast bulk of educational research at the moment, is mostly a waste of time and effort, and a lot of time and effort and money is being spent on this. The other two are sound, although the bottom one's the best, but not always possible to do. Now, sometimes projects involve more than one of these and it can bring them in combinations, so this is oversimplified. But we've got to think about our educational research and ask some very serious questions, because it's not making an impact. Now, at the moment, educational research goes in broadly two directions. Again, this is oversimplified. There's a kind of research which is mainly at PhD level. Now, there's some great research going on at master's level and postdoc level, but let's call it PhD at the moment. And then there's the research that comes out of projects. The problem with the PhD work at the moment, if you look at the PhD projects, when all the evaluations I've done and looking at other projects, it's rare to find one that gets beyond descriptive. And it's often just one survey with one questionnaire. Is that research? Does that take us forward? Now, I touched upon the other kind, the projects. These are often funded by governments or quasi-government organizations, competitive tendering, and they're almost always to look at something, a project, a development that has happened, and find out whether it works. So they're almost all descriptive. The two are almost the same. The problem is that the funding organization, if the description that comes up is positive, it gets extensively published. If the description comes up shows there are flaws in it, well, it doesn't hit the media headlines at all. It's quietly suppressed. Now, where's integrity there? But that's the pattern. But the problem, the central problem, is that word descriptive. We're never getting beyond describing what's happening. Now, there's a place for that. But if we stop there and we never ask the question why, what's the point? We're never getting pointed into a better way. Both of these end up with the researcher or the researchers making suggestions. But there may be clever suggestions, they may be good suggestions, but they're not based on research evidence. There's no evidence these suggestions will work because they've never been tested. That's the sad comment. And if you look at the publications that come out of it, we've got to be honest and say that happens to be true. And as a result, teachers pay little attention to research evidence. They know it's irrelevant. Educational planners and politicians pay little attention to research evidence. They know it's of little value. I want to focus on this for the moment, but a lot of the comments here could apply to wider research. So let's just bring it a light PhD level research. Now this is the kind of pattern that tends to happen. It varies from country to country, university to university. So I'm giving a broad pattern looking at the world. In many PhD programs in education, there's many months of coursework involved. Again, there's variability. The candidate then has to develop a detailed research proposal, and in some countries they're given 6 months to do it. What they propose to look at. Almost all demand the specification of research questions. And many demand the statement of theoretical frameworks. Most of them, and the evidence is there. Look at the evidence for yourself. Most of them end up gathering, collating perceptions and opinions. Questionnaires, focus groups, interviews. Would we decide on the best medical procedure by getting the opinions of people? No. We gather the objective evidence about which procedures, which drugs, which methods and ways forward bring greatest benefits to patients. Education should be no different. Most insist on highly detailed methodologies, with a whole chapter devoted to it, teasing out in infinite minutiae detail things that are usually self-evidently obvious. And many programs demand an indication at the outset of the likely benefits. Now, you can't predict where research is going. Let me give you an example. People argued for and against all that money being spent on the space race going back to the 1950s and 60s. One of the things that came out of that was that in order to control satellites moving in space, you had to have very good computers on board. The problem was weight. The computers of that time were big and heavy. So there was a search done to try and find out ways to make computers that were much lighter, because weight is so important in launching a satellite. That led to the discovery of the silicon chip. Think of the change to modern society throughout the world today because of the silicon chip. It has transformed our whole communications. It has transformed the whole way we do things. Indeed, it's transformed the way this very presentation has been developed. That could never have been predicted. And people could have looked at the project of putting a satellite in space, says that's a waste of money, there's no benefit. You see, you can't predict what's going to happen, and this is actually true. If you look at research worldwide across the disciplines, that there are things that come out that are utterly surprising, that can't be predicted, and it turned out to be incredibly useful for the benefit of human beings. That's a sad comment. The best research will be done by people who actually understand what's going on in teaching in schools and universities. That only can come by experience. That's something that needs to be addressed, and it will not be easy to address. Now let's look at other disciplines. Now again, this is an overall picture. But if you go out and talk to people, talk to PhD students across the disciplines, you can build up a picture. Here is a sort of picture. That's a general pattern. The research program the project is decided by the supervisor, not by dictation, it's with collaboration. Because the supervisor is equipped and knows what is known, knows the background research in the field. Supervisors tend to work in one area. They know what needs to be looked at next. They can link one PhD project outcomes to the starter point of the next PhD. Coherency. They don't use research questions. Now, they do ask questions. What education has done is said, oh, we've got to make it rigorous. We need research questions. But they've not understand the kind of questions that are asked by supervisors across other disciplines. And the word theory is understood properly. A reference at the end will be given which takes this apart in the educational field. And the word theory is rarely invoked because it's largely an irrelevance. And the data gathering is by diverse means. You just ask the question, if I want to answer and I want to look at this and I want to find out about, I want to know why, what sort of evidence do you need to gather? Then you find a way to gather it. That's the attitude of mind, that's the approach. And the idea of methodologies. I've seen examiners of PhDs say, you must justify why you used this methodology and what outcomes might have been obtained or would have been obtained if you used a different methodology. You cannot predict what you're going to get with a different approach. There's a flaw in the argument. And you can't predict the likely benefits with any precision. If you think you can, ask yourself the question, is this real research? And the candidates in other subject areas have practical experience in the subject discipline. It's very obvious if you look at the sciences. They've done extensive laboratory work, and that forms the baseline for the research they're going to do, which is often laboratory based. But there are equivalent patterns across other disciplines. In the humanities, they've done extensive projects in their first degree in the discipline where they've looked at some area in depth. That gives them the tools to be able to take it further into research. We've got a lot to learn. What are the pointers for the future? Well, we've got to listen to teachers and their students, because that's the central core of education. And if you just sit and talk to learners, school students, university students, let them talk, let them relax, gain their confidence, they will tell you from their perspective what they see as the problems, the issues, the difficulties. Even they may come up with other ways of doing things. Listen to the teachers in the staff rooms, the common teaching areas in universities. Listen to them. That will define an agenda very quickly. Now, there's got to be extensive background reading, and no PhD student has the time to do that before they do their PhD. That's part of the PhD, but the supervisor has already got that background reading. That's the normal pattern. And therefore the supervisor can direct the student and say, well, I think what you should do is start off by looking at this. And they look at something experimentally while they're doing more background reading. And the projects aren't one-off, a bright idea of students. Students find it incredibly difficult to produce this project proposal because it's a stupid way to go. It's not sensible. It's not realistic. The projects build one on another. Now the supervisor knows how they can build. I've seen cases where a PhD has raised a whole series of questions, and from that another 5 PhDs have followed. I've seen even a master's degree by research raise a whole series of questions from which several PhDs followed. sometimes in parallel, sometimes one after the other. Very often you don't even know where your project's going, so you make some initial observations, a few months of work at most, and then you analyze them quickly, and that defines the agenda. And then you say, well, now I've got to do this, or do that, or the other. That's sound research. You then pursue them. And I give an example again where one project did a quick survey of the key stakeholders and how they saw the problem area. That defined an agenda that was so large you could have got about 10 PhDs out of it. But the PhD student took 2 areas out of that. One was big, and one could be done more quickly, and pursued them in depth, making more measurements. The end of a study, you bring the things together, and that gives the pointers for the future projects. Not repeating the same thing with a different population, but taking us forward to the next stage, the next step. Now, this may be hitting you hard. To be credible, educational research needs to make measurements. We're no use just relying on exploratory study after exploratory study of exploratory study, which is what most PhDs in education never get beyond. They merely describe what's happening. They never get at the measurements and evidence about the why questions. Nobody takes it seriously. And again, sit in common rooms across universities and talk to academic staff in other disciplines and ask what they think of educational research. It's a frightening experience. Let's move forward. Here's a kind of summary of a possible way forward. The agenda to be driven by the needs of learners and their teachers. Now that implicitly, immediately demands that we know the needs of learners and we know the experiences of teachers, which is why it's so important in education that the researchers and the supervisors are experienced as teachers and can talk to learners. And I've known of situations where a PhD student, part of the project, off their own back, just got permission, and I think of one man where he talked to 100 students across a whole range of laboratories. He'd been working in the laboratories. The students were used to him. They didn't see him as a threat. And he just talked to them. And as he talked to them, he built up a vivid picture of the problem areas, the success areas, and why things were working or not working. You see, we're looking at practical answers to pressing problems, not problems we've created. It'd be nice to find out what they think of, but the pressing problems, and there are a lot of pressing problems on education today worldwide. Practical answers to pressing problems. Now, we can't guarantee we're going to get the answers, but we've got to start by looking at the pressing problems. And we've got to approach this by sound, measured evidence. Now, it isn't necessarily going to be always quantitative, but there needs to be more quantitative. But we're basing it at the moment on collated opinion. That's no way to go forward. No one will take that seriously. And the evidence shows it's not being taken seriously. If we get that right, the practicing teachers will read. Now, in one or two subject areas, there are good journals, which are not research journals, but give a distillation of findings and ideas that are helpful for practical teachers, both university and school. And if you look at it, teachers do read them. But they're not reading the primary journals at all. Why? One, they wouldn't understand them because they're so badly written with so much jargon, and secondly, the findings don't take them forward in a practical way. You see, that would bring enriched, enhanced learning to future students. That's what it's all about. That's the goal. Now, that's the exciting future. That's where education research could go, should go, and indeed can go. Because there are places in the world where it is being done. Back to our picture. Let's look at some of these examples. If you look at it worldwide, there are some trends happening. There are a few academic research centres, not parts and not one-offs in education faculties and schools. They're academic research centres. In the same way as you've got academic research centres that study all sorts of things in many disciplines, these are studying research related to teaching and learning, education. Sometimes they're tied to one specific discipline, sometimes to a group of disciplines, sometimes to across the board, but more often they're focused. The research they do is of a much higher quality. Not many of them, but they do exist. But there's a massively growing trend. This is happening throughout the world, where very able people who teach in subject departments, not education departments, are interested in the teaching and learning of their students and want the evidence. So they set up a subgroup within their subject department. They are teaching their subject discipline, but they're directing research with students of quality on the teaching and learning related to their subject discipline. Usually one discipline, occasionally a group. And some of these have generated paper after paper after paper after paper of quality work published in top journals. That has taken it forward, and it has had a particularly strong impact on university education, because inevitably these subject departments have focused more on that than schools. And in some subject areas there have been developmental changes that have taken place relatively quickly, which have changed the way subjects have been taught, presented, and all sorts of practical things that have brought benefit to university teachers and the students. There are numerous examples of that. But it's not being done in education, schools and faculties, where the system of PhD research almost rules it out, militates against it. You see, that's one of the key things I have observed. The staff, the academic staff who are directing the research, they are teaching the subject discipline. They're teaching at university level, but sometimes they've taught at school level as well. That makes a big difference. It roots everything in the practicalities of the real teaching and learning situation. That's taking us forward, and that's really good. And there are some wonderful quality PhDs have emerged from this. I'll draw attention to a few of these at the end. That's the pattern across almost all disciplines, but it's not true in education. In education, I've heard it stated many times, the statement is made, PhD students are just learning how to do research. We devalue the quality and ability of our PhD students. These are very able young people with flexible minds, great commitment and talents, who just need a bit of steer and direction, and they will generate things that are wonderful. They can be single-minded. But if you look at the disciplines in other areas, right across universities, the PhD students and the masters and the postdocs, they are the ones who do the research. The supervisors direct it, and they do direct it, they steer it. But they do the research and they publish with their students in top journals. Just look at the evidence. It has happened in education, but it's less common. Now, if you look at the theses that these PhD students generate, and I'll put up a few theses at the end, but inevitably they're drawn from my own students, they look very different. Download them, read them. You may be shaken by the sheer quality of what they've done. These were very able young people, perhaps not unusual. All PhD students are very able young people. But the structure they followed allowed them to blossom and flourish and take our understandings forward. I'm suggesting that it's not making an impact. Our policymakers ignore it, our teachers ignore it. And if you look at the quality of what's there and published, not great. It's definitely time for a change. Now this has been a kind of skirmish over the area, and I'm again putting up some references. I'll leave it on the frame for a moment, but you may want to come back at this frame and pick up things that might be interesting to you. I have picked these up mostly from my own students, and it's the student's work. It's the student's work that's been published, and the journals are all international. And I've got some idea about the citation rates. You see, these are addressing the real problems. And if you look down the list of the students, I know most of them had experience as practicing teachers at some level. And the projects were decided by the supervisor and were directed. And the student was released to some real wonderful quality work. Worth looking at these because it opens the door to possibilities. Now, I've put up 5 theses at the top. I've tried to pick ones that are reasonably modern, and they're all online. It can be downloaded free and easily. Problem solving. That one is, and the papers that arose from it are being cited all over the place. Scientific thinking. A lot of loose writing about that. This one gets some evidence. Working memory capacity, and it's related to a subject discipline. Working memory capacity, as our previous presentations have shown, is the central key thing that controls learning. Quality assurance, another huge bandwagon running worldwide. This gathers some evidence, but it has got a review worldwide of what's going on. And then critical thinking was taken following the same line as the scientific thinking one. Critical thinking, you see that phrase used across curricula. What is it? How do you develop it? This gets some evidence. And again, I refer to the book I wrote it a long time ago, been reissued now online. And although it was commissioned for one specific area, for one specific purpose, you can still pick up quite a number of ideas that are widely applicable in it. These things are all accessible online, but much of it you can find brought together in the first and the last chapters of this book. You can download the first chapter free, and the last chapter maybe you have to pay for. But that will give you a picture, and that is heavily referenced, and it brings things together. Yes, education, we're pushing a big weight up a steep slope. That is certainly true. Education research seems to have galloped away in a direction that's different from the pattern seen in most other subject areas. The next presentation is going to ask the question, why? What can we do about it? What are the practical ways we can move forward? This is spoken in generalities in this presentation. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail. And that's where we're going to move on to in presentation 4.